Now, we're not going to actually be covering all of the scientific information from the experiments, but I will link the document in the description below if you want to go and check it out in your own time. So now, let's look at the 5 main factors that Jacobo Grinberg was trying to assess and experiment with, and then we'll hear from Jacobo himself. They were trying to prove that brain activity exists outside of the skull, that this extra skull activity establishes a functional connection between different brains and unites them. That space is a component in our brain's perceptual construction of reality. Number 4, a fundamental energetic matrix exists behind every material object and physical manifestation. And finally, the feeling of individuality can be transcended to gain access to the perception of unity.
The experiment tried to see if there were direct brain-to-brain interactions, without the use of words, without the use of movements, without the use of sounds. So what we did was to build a sound-dampened chamber. This is a chamber that dampens the entry of sound from the outside, a chamber that is also visually opaque. We worked in total darkness and electromagnetically isolated, in such a way that it prevents the entry of electromagnetic waves. In this chamber, we invited a series of couples, we always worked with couples, to sit comfortably, close their eyes, not talk, not touch each other. And in this situation of absence of stimulation, the only thing that existed was the presence of one and the other. Sooner or later, what these two people began to feel was precisely this, the presence of one and the other. Until there came a moment when the sensation of most of them was that they were in direct contact. A little difficult to define, isn't it? What would be direct contact? They felt each other without needing to use language. At that moment, one of the two was invited to go to another chamber that we had also built beforehand with the same characteristics. That is, isolated, soundproofed, and electromagnetically shielded from the first in such a way. And this is very important, that there was no possibility of electromagnetic waves passing from one chamber to the other, at least of certain frequencies. In this situation, we invited them to remain in communication, that is, to feel, to continue feeling each other's presence. The one who stayed in the original chamber was stimulated. A series of flashes were applied to him, and his activity was recorded, provoked by the flashes, what we call an evoked potential. An evoked potential, well, it is the response of the cortex to the stimulus, a well-known response, and simultaneously we were recording the brain activity of the other person who was not stimulated, who did not know that his partner was being stimulated. And what we observed is that when an evoked potential appeared in the stimulated person, in the other person also appeared a potential that was synchronous with the appearance of the stimulus, with the presentation of the stimulus. We call this transferred potential or transfer potential. And what it is indicating is that one brain somehow established contact with the other brain directly, and what happened to the first brain had repercussions in the second brain without necessarily mediating consciousness. At least in our subjects, when asking them, for example, those who had had their transferred potential, did you feel anything? Did you know what happened to your partner? They said, well, I think something happened, but I'm not sure. That is, there was no need for the event to be conscious for it to happen, for the brain to register it. Now, what are the consequences? They are very broad, right? Because in the first place, it is telling us that the limit of brain activity is not the skull or even the cerebral structure, but that there is a level of brain activity that, so to speak, transcends the structure itself. And this can be explained in many ways. As Professor Delgado said before, the important thing in the brain is the interneuronal interactions. This is what gives a well intelligence, what gives cognitive capacity, etc., etc. It can be assumed that as a result of a huge series of interactions between the neuronal elements, interaction fields are created. And these interaction fields, which we call neuronal fields, may not be, and according to our experiment, limited by the cerebral structure, but affect the structure of space and by means of transmission from brain to brain. Now, this indicates that each of us is interacting all the time without knowing it, without necessarily being aware of it. There are interactions between us in such a way that Just as there is a network of interneuronal interactions, we can assume the existence of a network of intercerebral interactions, and this would allow us to assume the possibility of the existence of an organism that arises from these intercellular interactions. An organism, what does an organism mean? A level of activity that transcends us as individuals, of which we are part, and very probably the one that is affecting us, and we are affecting, which could perhaps be the structural or physiological basis, and of the new physiology of planetary consciousness, of a state of consciousness that includes us, that we are continuously feeding, and that is definitely affecting us. Because we could say, well, this network of intercerebral interactions, in some way, as the experiment shows, is affecting our brain activity. Therefore, we are receiving information from this network. I call it the hyperfield to give a name to this network.
Psychophysiological correlates of communication, gravitation, and unity. The syntergic theory, Jacobo Grinberg. The syntergic theory postulates that the brain creates an energetic field, the neuronal field, that expands into space, interacts with the space-matter continuum, is able to change the informational content of the lattice and thus affect other neuronal fields and physical forces. According to this theory, gravitation is a byproduct of the alteration in the informational content of the space-matter continuum, and human communication is based on neuronal field interactions. Don't worry if this doesn't make sense right now, because I'll be breaking it down just after this page. It is proposed that a brain operating in a highly coherent mode and in an abstract fashion, high neurosyntergic brain, creates a neuronal field that would decrease the gravitational forces around it. By the same token, a brain functioning in a relatively non-coherent mode and in a concrete fashion, a low neurosyntergic brain, creates a neuronal field that could shift the informational content of the surrounding space toward that modality. In the syntergic theory, experience is considered as the interaction between the neuronal field and the energetic, syntergic organization of space. A high neurosyntergic brain will experience unity, while a low neurosyntergic brain will experience reality from the vantage point of a personal ego. A high neurosyntergic brain would increase the synergy of space and thus would affect the experience resulting from the interaction of other neuronal fields with that altered space. What Grinberg is proposing here can be understood without technical language if you separate the ideas into a few core claims and then look at how they connect. So at the foundation of syntergic theory is the idea that the brain does more than produce thoughts inside the skull. It suggests that the brain generates a real physical field, called a neuronal field, that expands beyond the body into space, much like a magnetic field extends beyond a magnet. This field is not metaphorical. In the theory, it is an energetic structure that interacts with space itself. Space in this view is not empty. It has structure and information. The brain's neuronal field interacts with this space-matter continuum and can subtly alter its informational content. When space is altered in this way, it can influence other brains and even physical forces. Communication under this model is not only verbal or sensory. It is partly a field-to-field interaction between nervous systems mediated by space. Grinberg then makes a more provocative leap. He proposes that gravity itself may be a secondary effect of how information is structured in space. If the informational content of space changes, gravitational effects may change as well. In simple terms, gravity is not just mass pulling on mass, but a byproduct of how space is organized at an informational level. The state of the brain matters. A highly coherent brain, meaning the brain is functioning in a synchronized, integrated, and abstract mode, produces a different neuronal field than a fragmented, reactive brain. He calls the first a high neurosyntergic brain, and the second a low neurosyntergic brain. So let's break it down. A high neurosyntergic brain is associated with deep coherence, integration, and abstraction. In experimental terms, this corresponds to states where the senses of separation weakens. What people often describe as unity, oneness, or transcendence of ego. According to the theory, such a brain does not just expand unity internally, it actually increases the coherence of space around it. The altered space can then influence other brains interacting with it. A low neurosyntergic brain, by contrast, operates in a more fragmented, concrete, survival-orientated mode. This produces a neuronal field that reinforces separation, individuality, and ego-centered perception. The experience of reality becomes personal, divided, and object-focused rather than unified. Change the brain's coherence, and you change how it couples with space, which changes experience. This is where the theory attempts to bridge physics and consciousness. Grinberg argues that modern physics struggles to incorporate subjective experience because it treats space as passive and consciousness as secondary. The syntergic theory suggests that consciousness, space, and physical forces are deeply interconnected, that the brain actively shapes the space it inhabits, and that states of unity or separation are not merely psychological, but reflect how coherently the brain is interacting with the structure of reality itself.